Welcome, everybody. I'm doing this share tonight, as you can see, not as we usually do it live, but recorded. And I will tell you the reason why. We, as I mentioned to some people before, we have been blessed with 19 children who have been named after our son, Ari, Hashem Yikom Damo. The first of whom was Ari Preiser from Ginot Shomron, who was actually born just 2 hours prior to Ari being killed. And I was zochet to be the sandak at his brit and with him for his bar mitzvah. And today, even as we speak, he is being inducted into the army. His hashbah, his swearing in ceremony, is being held at the Kotel, originally for 7:30, but it was moved to 6 o'clock. Consequently, I'm grateful to our intrepid host, Yossi, for allowing me to tape this, and so that we can have a shiur tonight. And then I can participate as well in this very special occasion as Ari goes into the army, Bezrat Hashem, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will watch over him and all of our Chayalim Kadoshim. We want to dedicate this shiur and some shiurim as well in the future to the Refuah Shlema of Daniel David Yitzchak ben Shulamit, and many thanks to Amy and the Margolis family for sponsoring. So we're going to talk about Parshat Shlach and the subject of the Meraglim. We've talked about them before. It's a monumental, momentous, cataclysmic parsha, and I'm not just being hyperbolic. It really is a very crucial parsha and turning point in Jewish history. I would say if we had to talk about the top 4 or 5 events in Jewish history that are the most important, the story of the Meraglim would be in that top 5. And that's a bold statement, but I think it's correct, because what happens in the sin of the Meraglim is that all of our path, our projected pathway to Jewish history had to change. If not for what occurs in this week's Parsha, we would have entered Eretz Yisrael directly. We would not have wandered for 40 years. That first generation, which had many great people in it, of course, would have come directly into Israel, and everything perhaps would have turned out very, very differently. Instead, as you may know from the Parsha, after the Chet HaMeraglim, Hashem says, you are not going directly into Israel. In fact, Moshe Rabbeinu is not going to lead you into Israel, and you are going, this generation, to have to die out in the wilderness. And indeed, every year, actually it was 38 years, that 15,000 of the people would actually, Chazal say, dig their own graves, and Tisha B'Av would come, which was the date of when the sin of the Meraglim occurred, and they would not get up in the morning. Ultimately, it was a new generation that would enter Eretz Yisrael. And so things could have been very different, but this sin of the Meraglim prevented that. And so we have to examine what went on here, because the Meraglim were ostensibly great people. They were the creme de la creme. They were really not just the political leaders, but the spiritual leaders, and something went terribly wrong. So there are many, many explanations. I want to just focus on 1 or 2 issues tonight. The first one is that the mistake of the Meraglim, before we get maybe to the failing, but the mistake of the Meraglim was that they were meant to scout the land. They were supposed to see, the terrain, to do reconnaissance. What kind of a country is it? Is it a productive agricultural country? The people living there, what kind of people are they? What kind of climate is there? If we're going to have to wage war to go into Eretz Yisrael, well, what would the scouts report on in terms of best places to enter, the highlands, the lowlands, etc. They were not meant to draw conclusions. That was their mistake. They were meant to do their mission, report back to base, and let others, particularly Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe along with Yoshua, let them draw the necessary conclusions, essentially conferring with Hashem and understanding that we had already been given the green light that Hashem would take us into the land. So it was only a question of going in a semi-natural way, even though it was miraculous that we could go in and conquer 7 nations, having just come out of slavery. But it was to be done in a natural way. And that was ultimately and inevitably meant to be the bottom line. But instead, the Meraglim didn't just go and scout, but they made conclusions, and they decided that they were going to take it upon themselves to declare at the end of their mission that we can't do it. We're not able to do it. We'll talk about why in a moment, or what prompted that. I wanted just to tell a famous story that many people know, and there are different versions of the story, but it kind of sums up this idea of being sent on a mission. Do your mission, no less and no more. No more and no less. The story is told about a king who called his most faithful servant or assistant and said, I'm sending you to another kingdom. I have a letter for you to deliver to the king of that kingdom. And I'm only giving you one directive. When you're there, don't make any bets, no wagers whatsoever. I know this king, and I'm telling you, that's the one thing that you've got to be on guard against. So the messenger goes to this other kingdom. He's treated very nicely by the king. And the king says to him, I heard about you, and I'm glad that I'm meeting you. You're well known, and mainly for the fact that you are a hunchback. And the servant said, I am certainly not a hunchback. And the king said, oh, yes, you are. If you were to take off your shirt, everybody would see that you're a hunchback. And he said, well, that's just preposterous. And the king said to him, I am willing to give 50,000 gold coins to your king on a wager that you are a hunchback. And the servant thought to himself, well, I'm not supposed to make any bets, but this is easy money for the king because I know myself. I know I'm not a hunchback. And he said, I'm sure the king wouldn't mind if I did it. So sure enough, he took off his shirt, and the other king said, I guess you're really not a hunchback. And he ordered the 50,000 gold coins, 5,000, however many gold coins he wagered. Take that back to your king. And the servant was very proud of himself. He gave the other king the letter, and he went back to the kingdom. And as soon as he got there, the king ran to see him and said, how was it? Did you meet the other king? Tell me, you didn't make any wagers, did you? And the servant was very taken aback. And he said, I know that I said I wouldn't, but on the other hand, this was easy money. This was like taking candy from a baby. And the king began to rant and rave and said to him, you fool, don't you understand? I bet half the kingdom to this other king that you would make no wagers because you are a faithful servant who would follow my directions. And now I've lost half my kingdom. What do I care about a few thousand gold coins? There was one mission given to the Meraglim: scout the land. Don't go any further than that. But unfortunately, they didn't listen. And they almost destroyed the entire nation and certainly changed our history. But looking a little bit deeper into what went wrong with these Meraglim, and the only way I can really put it is that they failed to pass the test of faith, that they needed, you might pardon the expression, a faith lift. That was somehow, without getting too deeply into why they lost their faith, but in a sense, what happened, the ramifications of losing their faith. You know, in this week's Parsha, in addition to the story of the Meraglim, there are several other subjects at the conclusion of the Sedra. We talk about the karbanot, the nisuch hayayin, the offerings and the libations of the wine. We talk about challah, about separating challah. And these are all, we talk about the makoshesh etzim, the one who collects the wood and is ultimately executed. These subjects connect to the Parsha and the subject of the Meraglim, because essentially what the Torah is telling us, that even though this generation would not go into Israel, Hashem was saying, that doesn't mean Judaism and the Jewish people are coming to a close. You won't go, but we will continue. We'll have a Beit HaMikdash, and we'll have offerings. We'll have Kohanim that we can separate and give challah to. And in the story of the collector of wood, if you violate Shabbat, then you will pay a price, just as he does. There's going to be an ongoing Jewish people. But then we have the final subject of tzitzit. What is that doing here? I understand the others, giving people hope and saying to them, even though we have this terrible trauma of this generation dying out, Judaism goes on with the next generation. But what about the tzitzit? What does that have to do with anything? So Chazal tell us there's one word that connects. In tzitzit, we know the psukim we say every day when we say Shema and we talk about the tzitzit, and we say, or item oto, you shall see them. And when you see the tzitzit, you will appreciate all of the mitzvot, and you will appreciate the fact that, in a sense, you are the royal servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the tzitzit or the talit. This is part of our royal madim, our uniform that we wear. So it's something that you look upon it and you recognize we are a holy, chosen people. And the same word, of course, exists with the Meraglim, where they're told, or item et haaretz, you will see the land. And the problem with the Meraglim was that they saw things, but they did not see them through eyes of faith. And so they misinterpreted everything they saw. They saw a lot of people dying, and they thought this famous phrase that we still use today sometimes, Eretz ochelet yoshvehi, the land, the ground, the earth is eating up or swallowing up people. This is a place, they concluded, where too many people will die. And so that gave them a very negative feeling. They didn't understand that Hashem was causing some of the evil people in the land to die from a kind of plague. And so everybody would be preoccupied with these funerals and not notice the Meraglim who were going through the land scouting. They saw a giant fruit. We all know about the symbol of the cluster of grapes, that you need a pole to carry it because it's so heavy, it's so enormous. And they thought, well, kashem perot meshuneh, kacha aretz meshuneh, just as the fruit is abnormal, is something unnatural, so too maybe this is the way this country is in general. It's not a normal place. There is some truth to that, but they saw it in a negative fashion. And then they also saw the people were living in forts. The cities were fortified. And they said to themselves, how could we ever conquer such a place? They have these huge forts, and how are we going to be able to break down the forts? And they didn't realize and understand that who lives behind big walls and fortified areas? People who are weak and who are afraid. If you're strong, you don't need to live in a fort. You can defend yourself. You're not afraid of anybody. They drew all the wrong conclusions because although they saw things, or item et haaretz, unfortunately, they didn't see it through eyes of people who had faith, who could interpret what seems to be objective reality, but there is no such thing. Two people can see the same event or the same object, and they can draw completely different conclusions. And how often have we seen that in history? You can see the splitting of the sea and you can think, well, that's high tide, low tide. You can see the 6-Day War and you can say, well, we had better generals, better strategy, the elements of surprise, or you can see these things and understand that they're miraculous, that Hashem is doing miracles for us constantly, but doing it sometimes, usually in a way that you have to make a choice. People of lesser faith have more outright miracles. People of greater faith have miracles that occur on an everyday basis. It's like a child being born. It happens all the time. But I think most people see the miracle in it and understand that just because it happens frequently doesn't mean it's not a great miracle. It's how you interpret the stimuli that are in front of you. And if you have faith, you interpret it completely different from somebody else. Essentially the opposite. They think it's a disaster. They think it's a negative. You say it's a miracle and it's a great positive. And that was the flaw, the fatal flaw of the Meraglim. And after all we had experienced with all of the miracles that we had gone through in the Midbar, we still didn't really have the trust in Hashem to believe with faith that whatever is happening and unfolding before us, that's for our benefit. And that's something which Hashem is doing ultimately to protect us, even if we, perhaps to the naked eye, can't tell. And that's the idea of the tzitzit, as I said before, or item oto. When you look at them, and the minhag is to lift up the tzitzit at that point, to look at them, but not just to look at the strings, but to understand through the act of doing a mitzvah that we're going to be protected. As a friend of mine, Rabbi Gold, likes to say, had I not believed it, I never would have seen it. And that's the essential message, that when you believe in something and you have faith, your eyes will open and you will see the truth and see the miracles that are around you. So instead of losing faith when things seem to be unfortunate or negative, with a little bit of faith, you can turn that around and you can see within it the seeds of something good that's going to happen. So I wish everybody have a Shabbat Shalom and see good things, interpret them well and positively, and Kadosh Baruch Hu should watch over us, and ultimately this generation that has made it to Israel. And if there are some out there who haven't yet, will make it to Israel, and we will be the ones to reverse the sin of the Meraglim and to complete that journey that started shortly before in Mitzrayim and ends here with the Geula Shlema B'mher B'yameinu. Amen. Thanks to everyone.